This morning's scripture comes from Matthew chapter 28 and John chapter 4. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am always with you to the end of the age. So he came to the Samaritan city called Sychar, and near a plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus was tired from his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. The Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman?" Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who is saying it to you, 'Give me a drink,' then you would ask him, and he would give you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flock drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water that I will give to them will never be thirsty. The water that I give them will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, Go call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband.' You have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming here and now when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in truth and spirit." The woman said to him, "I know the Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will proclaim all things." Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." Just then the disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with a woman, but no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you speaking with her?" The woman left the water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, "Come and see the man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" They left the city and were on their way to him.
Thank you for the invitation to come to worship with you today. We've enjoyed sharing ideas on mission with Pastor Allen in the last few weeks, and we feel privileged to be invited to share with you. But when we come into a new congregation that we do not know real well, it can be a real daunting opportunity. One never fully understands what a group of people know about mission, whether it's good or bad. We would like to share our personal story about being engaged in the global mission experience in Africa, the Middle East, and North America. This is because this is the story we know most intimately, and we're hoping that some of the ideas we gained can be shared with you that might bring about some interest for you and for your edification. In the beginning, we never expected to be missionaries. We were signed up to go to BVS because I had to do my selective service during the Vietnam era. And then we planned to go on to Bethany Seminary and become pastoral ministry people. But Joel Thompson from the Elgin offices came to McPherson College in April of 1967. He was recruiting teachers for Waka schools. He gave us 24 hours to make up our minds if we'd be willing to go to do a 3-year teaching assignment. Since we were scheduled to get married in June, we thought, well, 3 years in Africa would be a nice honeymoon, wouldn't it? It's not quite BVS, but it would be a similar experience. So that's how we got started being missionaries. We went to live out the Great Commission of Matthew 28. Go into the world and make disciples. Boy, were we naive.
So we went to Nigeria in 1967. Sorry, our map did not show up very well, but you probably are familiar with the country of Nigeria in West Africa. The Nigerian Civil War, called the Biafran War, was raging. We were delayed in going since the airport in Kano, where we were to land, had been bombed. Our departure was delayed a month until the airport was open again and the planes could land. This was our first experience in learning to go with the flow, not being able to control many situations. Upon arrival, we were instructed not to call ourselves missionaries because we might be misinterpreted as mercenaries. We were assigned to Waka schools. Next slide. This was an institution established by the Church of the Brethren Mission, which I will call CBM. It was both a secondary school and a teacher training college located on a lovely campus outside the town of Butte, which is in the western part of the mission, Church of the Brethren Mission area. Roger taught Bible and geography in both schools, and I taught domestic science, which you would call HOMAC, and English in both schools, depending upon where we were both needed. Next slide. All classes were taught in English, and students were punished if they spoke anything but English in the school area. They needed to learn good English so that they could pass the West African School Certificate at the end of their 5 years at Waka. They could speak their tribal languages in the dormitories, and they did so. Our other duties included supervising evening study halls, monitoring dorm life, leading clubs, and coaching sports teams. Next slide. When we arrived, most teachers were from the U.S., with a handful being Nigerians. The campus was a little America, with so many teachers from the U.S. We shared meals in each other's homes, played table games and volleyball or tennis with each other in the evenings. That made adjusting to this environment very easy. But it was hard to feel like we knew the Nigerian culture. So we took our school breaks to travel to the villages of our students, meet their families, and learn more about Nigerian life. By the end of our 3 years there, more Nigerians began to teach at the school. And this was influenced by a shift in mission philosophy that was happening in the late 1960s. We had been sent out under the colonial model of mission to convert the heathen of Africa to Christianity, to preach in the villages, to teach in the schools, and to work in the hospitals. The philosophy of indigenization was taking effect. This was that the Nigerians would take more responsibility for education and medical work, and they would take full control of the Nigerian church work. This was a difficult change for those who had gone under the colonial philosophy and had served there for years and years. Remember that scripture that was read from John, the encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman? In this story, Jesus is reaching across many barriers of gender, ethnicity, and social status. What is often missed in this story is the ending, where the woman goes to her own people and the whole village become believers. This is a wonderful example of the principle of indigenization. The local person is most effective in sharing the good news of the gospel.
Next slide, please. You'll notice in this map on the very far right, the light green and purple is the area where Church of the Brethren mission work has been working for many, many years, and it's the area where the EYN church is located. In 1971, when we went back to Nigeria for the second time, we found that Nigeria was just recovering from the Biafran War, and they were extremely hesitant to issue visas for any expatriates to go there to work. But since we had residency visas, we could return. But we said we would not return to teach at Waka schools because we did not want to take jobs from the Nigerians. So we moved to Garkita. Next slide. You can see that the Garkita is a much more rural village, even though it's quite dark in this picture, where I was asked to become the business manager for the medical work of the Church of the Brethren. And I was to be supporting a Nigerian who was to be the medical administrator. We agreed to do this assignment with the understanding that we would have a 3 months Hausa language training course, because we had learned at Waka that if you really wanted to communicate with the Nigerians, you need to communicate in their language and not expect them to meet you in your language. Halfway through our Hausa language training, we found out that the man I was to work with decided not to take the job. So I was asked then to become the medical coordinator whose task it was to find and train 3 administrators for 2 general hospitals and a leprosarium. That decision also was made that we would make a transition in the medical work from being institution-based to being community-based. And that was a huge, huge transition. Besides the hospitals, we had the Rural Health Program, which some of you may have heard of, the LAFIA program, which was talked about here in the United States. This meant that we were training health workers using traditional methods of storytelling, song, and dance for 114 other villages. It was during this era that Nigeria became an oil-producing nation. With this newfound wealth, they decreed that medical salaries should increase 100%. That's a lot of an increase. We were grateful for our staff that they could get that. But that meant we had to find $76,000 extra money to pay those salaries. We said to the government, that's good that the people can get those salaries, but you need somehow to help with subsidies because the people we're serving are not wealthy enough to pay the rates at which will sustain that kind of a medical system. When that didn't happen, we said to the government, we have no choice but to close these institutions. After some very tense negotiations, we agreed to continue to operate the hospital for an additional 6 months to give the Nigerian government a chance to turn over to them the work that was done there. Some of the Nigerian church leaders wanted us to turn the hospitals over to them, but we said, look, if you take on those responsibilities without the support from the government, it'd be like a millstone around your neck. It will drag you down. So the decision was made that we would turn the hospitals over to the Nigerian government. Next slide, please. So in March of 1976, the hospitals were turned over to the Ministry of Health of the Northeast state of Nigeria. We then, after finishing that, were able to leave Nigeria in 1976. It was a very gratifying time to learn that the World Health Organization had used the model that we had changed from institution-based to community-based care as one of the 3 viable models for Africa for healthcare systems.
Next slide, please. Now we move to Sudan. The left slide shows that Sudan's location within Africa. Am I on? And the other slide shows the size of that country, which at that time was the largest country in Africa, put on top of the western part of the United States. So, The Sudan Council of Churches was based in Khartoum, the capital city, in the northern part of that country. They had heard about the Lafia program that the Church of the Brethren had done in Nigeria, and they wanted to use that model to start some work in a remote area in Sudan. Thus, they sought out the Church of the Brethren to send someone to help them get that work started. The Church of the Brethren figured that those that had done the Lafia program work were the most logical ones to send to Sudan. But the church was reluctant to ask a family with small children to go to an unknown remote area. Next picture. Our boys were in first and second grade, but they did ask us to go. And so after some time to pray and consider, we said yes to this call.
It doesn't show real well, but in the very middle, you'll see the word Bentu and a long, narrow area. That's the remote area we were sent to.
Thus, in 1980, the Church of the Brethren expanded its mission involvement after 70 years in Nigeria to include a new location in Sudan. Sudan had been engaged in a civil war for 30 years and more. It was during a 10-year hiatus from fighting that the Sudan Council invited us to come and work. We were seconded by the Church of the Brethren to the Sudan Council of Churches to implement a primary health care program. Now, seconding means that the Church of the Brethren provided the financial assistance for us, but the Council of Churches was the boss, making all the decisions about the program and the way that we worked. This was a new way for brethren to do mission work, to be seconded to an African council. Since Sudan is a Muslim country, they did not allow Christian missionaries to come into their country. Thus, we went as primary health care workers under the government's Ministry of Health. We were sent to Mayum in the western Upper Nile province, which is close to the town of Bentu there. Our program work included assistance with human health, animal health, clean water, and food production. We also started a church. Next slide, please. This was an early church service. No building, usually under a tree, but on this day it was cold, and so we sat in the sun to be warm. We moved the family to a small village called Mayum. Next slide. First, we lived in a tent while a mud and grass house was being built. Next slide. We struggled to learn Arabic and newer languages as we began the work. Our boys, being young, learned both languages immediately. Roger managed the program, sought out Sudanese staff to work with us, and raised money from the U.S. and from Europe for the project. Caroyln managed family life, learned how to feed the family on local foods, and homeschooled our two boys. During this time in the early 1980s, oil was being discovered in South Sudan. Remember, we had oil before in Nigeria. Well, this increased the conflict between the northern and southern parts of the country because the oil was mostly in the south, but it was controlled by the government in the north. And as you can see, we were right at the border between the two parts of the country. Well, this tension caused the next phase of their civil war. With increased tensions, we learned to trust the local people for our safety. Our Land Rover was attacked in December of 1983, with 2 people being killed and 3 injured. The Sudan Council thought that we needed to evacuate. but we pleaded to be able to stay. They consented that if the local chief would agree to watch the situation and tell us when it was no longer safe to be there, they would agree. So one morning, Chief Luke came and said, with the rainy season coming and the closing of all road access to our village, he felt that we needed to leave. They didn't think that they could ensure our safety any longer. So we did leave at the end of May. We returned to the United States and moved to Elgin, Illinois, where Roger began to work in the national offices. And I taught high school, and our boys did middle school and high school.
Next photo, please. Oops, we missed one somewhere. In 1989, I applied for a sabbatical from my position as executive for the World Ministries Commission of the Church of the Brethren. The sabbatical was to study Arabic in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, and then to travel to the southern part of Sudan to learn about the reported very, very great rapid growth of the church in the war zone. The sabbatical plan was approved, but before I could even go, I received a call from the South Sudanese church leaders asking for me to just take a short visit to Khartoum and then come help them establish the Council of Churches in the war zone. I got permission to revise the sabbatical with the understanding that my time in the South would be a time to mutually discern if their invitation to head up the Council of Churches was good from their perspective and from our perspective. So I went, met with the church leaders, and after a very short meeting, like about 2 hours, they said, "You're to be the new executive." I said, "Wait a minute, this is supposed to be a mutual discernment process." "Well, we've discerned," they said. And I said, "But I've not talked to Caroyln. That's part of the mutual discernment." So I was not sure if I was going to say yes or not, but then I had a visit to Nasser, a community near to the Ethiopian border, which we knew from before had the largest Presbyterian church in South Sudan. They had about 680 members. And I went there to find out if they were still existing as a church, because for 6 years, no one had visited in the war zone, so we only heard stories. So I went to visit, arrived on a plane from the UN, and was met by a group of 100 people who were singing and dancing, and they danced me all the way across the town to the church. We got into the church, and we sat down and did the typical African greetings. "How's your family? How was the night?" Da, 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 da. And then I said, "Can I ask you some questions?" "Of course." I said, "If I remember right, back in the 80s when we were first here, you had about 680 members in this church." "That's correct, sir." "How many do you have now?" 3 elders put their heads together and said, 22,383. I said, "I didn't mean the whole area, I mean in this church." 22,383. "My goodness, then how many pastors have you had?" Again, the conversation. "A pastor has visited us 6 times in the last 6 years." That's amazing. They said, "Well, can we ask you a question now?" "Well, of course." When the missionaries came, they told us that as we became Christians, we were to support each other, to go visit and do that kind of thing as a Christian in the body of Christ. Yeah, that you learned the lesson well. The question then, why did no one come visit us for 6 years? What do you say? The only thing I could say is, "Well, I've come." And then the question was, "Will you stay Sunday and preach for us?" "Well, I would be honored to." We met under 3 big trees because the church wasn't big enough to hold the group. And I had learned while being there that the people were eating 1 meal a day because that's all they could get for their food. So I wondered what would happen because, you know, in a good Presbyterian service, everything comes in decency and order. And the offering always comes right after the scripture and the prayer and the sermon. So I was waiting, And to my amazement, the altar was completely covered with grain. And I turned to the evangelist Matthew and I said, Matthew, I said, you said to me that you have only one meal a day. How can you have this food? He looked at me strangely and he said, Sir, we fast one day a week so others who have less than we do will have food to eat. We had no choice but to go back. So 4 days after Jed, our youngest son, went off to college, Caroyln and I returned to the south of Sudan to help establish the new Sudan Council of Churches. You may say, well, why did they have a new council in the war zone? Because when the church leaders in the council based in Khartoum would reach out to the brothers and sisters in South Sudan, they were accused of treason because they were reaching across the enemy lines in the areas controlled by the SPLA, the rebel army. So the church leaders mutually agreed that they would form a new council of churches in the war zone, that when peace came could then be reunited into one. And that's why we went back to go there. We went to the town of Torit, which is on the eastern side in southern Sudan. Things were quite rudimentary, and we had a difficult time finding food. But we were warmly received by the leaders in the Southern Sudan church. And our task in the council was to try to build relationships between the Christians that found themselves isolated by the war. And secondly, to build relationships with international churches and NGOs to help support the needs of the people in that area. My role was executive secretary, to be the leader of the council, and Caroyln's role was to be the director of communications. But because we were living in Torit and that town was overrun by the government troops, we had to flee for our lives to Kenya. We then established offices in Nairobi, Kenya, and had to commute between Nairobi and South Sudan. This location in Nairobi allowed us to better communicate with our international partners, but increased the communication problems within South Sudan. Caroyln established, you're ahead of us a little bit. Go back one, I believe, if you can. Yeah. Caroyln established a 22-station single sideband communication system which allowed us to communicate with different areas of South Sudan and help warn the people of problems that were coming. Many of the international partners that we related to wanted to come and visit South Sudan because it had been 6 years that nobody had visited, so everybody wanted to say, what happened? What's going on? And so Caroyln spent a lot of time making arrangements for travel into South Sudan for these international guests. But the major accomplishments that we had as the New Sudan Council of Churches for the 4 years we were based in Nairobi can be summarized as, first, now the slide of the kids, providing food and material aid to help people survive the hardships of war.
Next slide.
We think, we cannot scientifically prove, but we think about 250,000 people are now alive today that would not have been alive if we had not been able to provide those kinds of services. Secondly, we helped organize, and I want you to hear this, joint discipleship training between Catholics and Protestants. Now, I'm sure you have a very ecumenical community here in Wichita, but I've not heard of Protestants and Catholics doing discipleship training together. Maybe you have something to learn from them. We also spent a lot of time in peacemaking. Next slide, please. This resulted in a people-to-people peace program which helped end the Civil War in 2005. The New Sudan Council and Churches invited international church leaders like Desmond Tutu, the World Council of Churches, and the Vatican to assist in the peace talks, which finally got regional governmental leaders to negotiate an end to the 60-year conflict. Our role as NSCC leaders came to an end in 1995 when we turned our roles over to other Sudanese leaders. We've always understood that our role as missionaries was to work ourselves out of a job. that's what we did.
Upon arrival in the U.S., the Church of the Brethren did not have any work to assign us to do. So we took a call to work with the Reformed Church of America for Roger to supervise mission programs and people in the Middle East and India. Next slide.
We got it.
Okay. This work was based from Orange City, Iowa, where we lived for the next 5 years. Roger traveled back and forth to Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Cyprus, Egypt, and India. I taught public school and then was Christian education director for the local Reformed church. This was a time of healing from the stress of living and working in a war zone. Orange City was a quiet, small town where very little aggravated our PTSD, except when the wind blew a door shut and we went flat on the floor for fear of shelling. Or when the local medical helicopter flew low over our house and we remembered the times that we had to listen for airplanes when we lived in Torit, because some of them were bombers, and if so, we had to run and get in the bomb shelters. If not, if the sound was different and we knew it to be the relief plane bringing support, then we didn't have to run to the bomb shelters.
After I had finished my 5-year commitment to helping the Reformed Church in America, the Kabul Church of the Brethren in south central Missouri asked me to come be their pastor. They specifically wanted help in connecting with the global church. Given our experience in Nigeria, Sudan, and the Middle East, I thought I probably could do that. One specific example of making this connection occurred after 9/11. Given the shock of the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York and the response of blaming Muslims for this atrocity, we decided we needed to suspend all of our church school classes and offer several weeks of training by offering Islam 101 to help our folks know that the followers of this radicalized version of Islam do not faithfully represent the millions of Muslims who try to live out their lives in submission to Allah. We ended this class by celebrating the breaking of the fast of Ramadan with the Muslim community in Springfield, Missouri. You please put the next map of South Sudan up. Notice this map of Sudan. You'll see Sudan is to the north, and then you'll see Juba to the south. That southern part is now the South Sudan. So the big country of Sudan has been broken into 2 parts. After the peace agreement in 2005, which ended the last active phase of civil war, the Church of the Brethren sent one of our Sudanese colleagues from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to go back to work in eastern Equatoria. Please, next slide. Eastern Equatoria, you'll notice Juba near the bottom, and then to the right of that is Torit, and that big area is Eastern Equatoria area where Athanasius Ungang worked with the African Inland Church as our partner and established the Brethren Peace Center just outside of Torit. Next slide, please. There's Athanasius right beside the Brethren Peace Center gate. With the passing of the referendum, which created South Sudan as the newest country in Africa in 2011, the Brethren work focused on peace, education, and support for Christians in the Eastern Equatoria region. In 2013, when a major conflict between the president and the vice president erupted, fighting again engulfed much of this new nation. The focus of the work transitioned to helping provide material aid and food to those displaced by the conflict. Trauma healing, next slide please, became an important thing, and this is a picture of a workshop being conducted in Torit for helping those people going through the war. The next part of the focus was on church planting. Athanasius, as a son of the soil, is well positioned and culturally attuned to help promote peace, and reconciliation. Thus you can see that the carefully laid plans have had to change again, and flexibility is a paramount characteristic for mission endeavors. Caroyln and I were able to return for a short mission trip visit in 2015, and I led 2 additional mission trips to South Sudan in 2016. New slide, please. That's the group right there. And in 2019. Our roles have transitioned from mission leaders to those who support and stand in solidarity with South Sudanese Christians. One of the ways I do this is to serve on the Mission Advisory Council for the Church of the Brethren, the Global Mission and Services Office in Elgin. So, after hearing all these strange and crazy stories, do you really want to be involved in mission? That's not even the correct question. The question is, what does God want of you individually and you as a congregation? What is the Wichita Church of the Brethren to do? May God's Spirit guide you and accompany you on this exciting new journey ahead.
Thanks for watching this video from the First Church of the Brethren in Wichita, Kansas. If you'd like to watch another video, click the link on the right. Thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing on this video. And we'd love to have you join us on Sundays at 9:30 for Sunday school and 10:45 for worship. Everyone is welcome and you're invited.